Hi, everyone, and welcome back. This is the third mini lecture of week 1. This is the third topic that we're covering this week, and it's called pre-assessment considerations. So this is before your initial consultation with your client, before you even begin any sort of assessments. So what should be included in the pre-assessment, that initial consultation with your client? For the purposes of this course, we're going to discuss 3 pre-assessment considerations. And I want it to be very clear here that the same fitness principles apply to healthy and elite populations. So from an elderly individual to an injured individual to an elite or professional athlete, the same pre-assessment considerations must be put in place. The first is a health screen. So you want to identify potential health complications, contraindications to exercise. You want to classify the disease and injury risk, get medical clearance if necessary, and obtain informed consent, both verbally and in writing, for all assessments and work done. And I provided you with a hyperlink embedded in the PowerPoint slides that you can access some of these resources through the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology website. The second pre-assessment consideration is that you really want to develop client rapport and develop a relationship with your client. That means getting to know them, finding out and identifying the motivation, why they're there, their goals, their attitude towards exercise and physical activity, their fears of exercise, time commitment, all of these factors. Get to know them. And this is one of the most important pre-assessment considerations. Second of all, you want to discuss the history of physical activity, exercise training, sports, nutrition, sleep habits, injury, overall health. And then lastly, discuss their occupation and their home demands, etc. So you're really developing a profile of your client. This is extremely important. The third piece to consider for pre-assessment consideration is develop their physical fitness profile. So this is really based on the information that you've gathered from the rapport, and it's also based on historical and current information. So you want to classify your client as either being a beginner, intermediate, or advanced in each area of fitness. So you classify them based on their cardiovascular fitness, based on how often they're exercising per week, as well as their resistance training experience. So they could be a beginner in cardiovascular training, but an intermediate in resistance training or vice versa. And so I've provided some links on this slide as well as the next to sources that you can use in order to classify your client based on the information that you've gathered from the client rapport and this pre-assessment. This slide is providing 2 examples of what I believe are essential pre-assessment resources. The first one on the left is CSEP's Physical Activity and Sedentary Behavior Questionnaire. This really provides an overview of their sedentary time, their occupational demands, as well as their physical activity profile. On the right is a fantastic lifestyle questionnaire or checklist. I find this to be a fantastic, pun intended, checklist to use on clients to gather a lot of information in a short period of time. So this pre-assessment also allows us to determine the needs of the individual, and that's called a needs analysis. You're determining the needs of the individual based on their motivation, based on their classification of cardiovascular fitness and resistance training, and then that enables you to pick the most appropriate assessments. So remember, this is the pre-assessment. This is before you classify their or determine their physical capabilities. You're determining their profile. Okay, so it's very important that you use pre-assessment resources well. So the pre-assessment is vital in order to properly classify the status of your client, leading to proper selection of assessment tools. Now we're moving into our last discussion piece for this week's lecture series, and this is the physical assessment. So you've done the pre-assessment, you've asked the questions, you developed a history, you developed rapport, and you've classified their experience. Now we're moving into the actual physical assessment. So now you're picking assessments based on the pre-assessment information that you gathered. So the question becomes, what are the reasons for conducting a client assessment? And the use of the pre-assessment information will allow you to select assessments most suited for the classification, the history, and the goals of your client. Now let's discuss the reasons for conducting a client assessment, or the reasons for testing an individual. The first is identifying physical abilities, what they're good at, what they're not so good at, what they need to improve. Second of all, conduct a gap analysis, which we'll discuss in more detail in the coming slides. Thirdly, the requirements for specific goal setting and exercise prescription. You need to do a client assessment. You need to test the individual to ensure that you're prescribing properly. There is no cookie cutter approach to program design. People will come up to you and say, hey, can you make me a program? You should say, well, first I need to assess you so that I can set you up for success. Set yourself up for success as a practitioner and set them up for success. And then lastly, retesting allows you to track progress to see if the individual is adapting well to your training prescription. And if not, then you need to change something. Now let's move into discussing each of these reasons for testing. The first one is identifying physical abilities. So you really want to determine the client's basic physical abilities, their limitations, and capacity and tolerance to exercise or to the demand that's placed on them. So you really want to pick and select assessments specific to the individual based on their pre-assessment information and their daily needs, based on their needs analysis and demand analysis. This really crosses ages and experience. It doesn't matter for even an elderly individual versus a young child that you may be training. You have to identify what their capacity and tolerance is. Here are some examples that where different programs are identifying physical abilities. So it could be used in sport for talent identification. So there's this program run by RBC. It's called RBC Training Ground. And it's this huge combine to identify sprint-based physical abilities. And this is combined with technical and tactical training with the hope that potentially they are recruiting individuals that will be elite athletes for a given sport. In my experience as an athlete, I was recruited by Speed Skating Canada while I was with the national hockey program. And they put me through a battery of tests to assess my physical abilities, capacity, and tolerance. This was mostly through very hard bike tests, no on-ice testing. And the reason for this is they wanted to see if my physiology reflected the talent that could make an Olympic speed skater. So it was a pretty cool experience. But essentially the testing and the tests that were picked were used to identify my physical abilities that would translate to good performance in speed skating. So ultimately, you want to pick tests that identify the physical abilities of the specific client. The second reason for testing is the gap analysis. And this is, as you can see in this optic, we have our current state on the left, and then the desired state on the right. And in between is what's considered the gap. And as you can see, the vertical lines indicate the steps to bridge the gap. And so those steps are then made into an action plan. Okay, this is the gap between where I am currently and where I want to be. And this is the action plan. And that action plan is really some sort of program to help you get and mitigate, close that gap. So this is really how you do this is you compare your client's results to published standards for that individual's sex, age, and ability level. And a lot of these standards are published in the back of textbooks that are kinesiology related textbooks, showing you how many max push-ups are done in 60 seconds or what normative values are for VO2 max, for below average, average, excellent, etc. Okay, so you find you test them to test your client, and then you compare that to published normative standards. And that gives you an identification of what their physical abilities are. You classify the individual, and then you determine what their gaps are. So ultimately, you create an action plan, their goals, based on the gap analysis. So this slide provides an example of a popular test that's used to really assess transition, leg strength, balance, coordination, etc. It's most popular in elderly populations. So this test is a sit to stand. So as you can see in the optic on the left, an individual is sitting on a chair with their arms crossed, and they're essentially just standing up and then sitting back down. On the right is the published normative standards for a 30-second sit-to-stand test. So you can see, you find out what the client's age is, and then you classify them as either very poor, poor, below average, average, above average, good, or excellent. And then you can get an idea of the muscular endurance, muscular strength of the individual, their balance and coordination, and see whether this is something that needs to be improved or maintained. So the third component here is the assessment leads to specific goal setting and exercise prescription. So once you've done the assessments, you compared to normative averages, you did your gap analysis, and now you're able to create goals that are SMART, based on the SMART principles. And this really allows for the non-cookie cutter approach. We really want it specific to the individual, specific to their needs and the demands placed on them. The last reason for conducting testing is that we can track progression through retesting. So the two questions are, is the individual adapting well to the exercise program? Are they improving? Are they flatlining? Are they decreasing in performance? Those are things you need to know. And by doing test and retests, you're able to assess whether they're improving or not. Second of all, is the training, plan effective at developing the physical abilities needed to improve in health, sport, injury, occupational demands, etc. Okay, so here we see an optic performance over time. Performance can either be flatlined, which is green, it can decrease over time, which is red, or it should be going up in a stepwise progression over time. And that's a sign of an effective program. So by retesting, it motivates your client to adhere to the training plan and provides feedback to you about whether the training plan is effective. Because if you're not retesting, you don't know if the individual is improving. And you don't want to leave testing too long. Otherwise, you may not change the program enough to see them improve. You want to catch whether they're flatlined or decreasing in performance to ensure that you change things up and make it effective for them. So remember, first things first, preliminary health evaluation, relationship building, and informed consent. Those are the most important. That pre-assessment is so important for gathering the information needed to select proper tests. Then you need to know the four main reasons for tests and retests, as we talked about. And the assessment piece is so vital to ensure that you're properly going to prescribe exercise, that there should not be this cookie cutter approach, that every individual must be treated as an individual and customize a plan specific to their demands, needs analysis, and their gap analysis.